With the publication of this new book on AlphaZero, Game Changer, I've been inspired to go back and look at some of these games from the Stockfish AlphaZero match. And there's one that I mentioned in my book review where I gave the very end of this game, but I thought it might be good to look at the whole thing. So here we go. Stockfish AlphaZero, played in January 2018. Incredible, a year ago. And this was not played from a set opening. It's just from the starting position. What I find really interesting is that in this modern cutting-edge match between these two great chess-playing entities, that actually they're playing an opening that was popular 150 years ago. So, after knight f6, now d3 will lead to a gioco piano, but knight g5, this really brutal attack on f7. So, d5 is the best way to deal with this. And after pawn takes, well, we shouldn't really play knight d5, that's a mistake. Knight f7 is interesting with this absolutely crazy variation starting like this. But maybe the best move here is actually d4, but alright, that's another story. So because of that, knight a5 is generally played. Attacking the bishop, so the bishop gives a check, so not doesn't lose time, and then c6. So this means that black is now a whole pawn down. So this is a gambit line, very old gambit line. Now bishop d3 was played in our game. The most popular move is bishop e2. So I found a game in my database from Adolf Anderssen, the great Anderssen, the other great Anderssen, from 1878. So you can see how old this variation is. And the main line goes h6 and like this. The knight comes into the middle and black takes and knight takes d3. And I mean, I've played this a couple of times with white. I always found it very surprising that black has decent compensation here for the pawn, because this knight seems so out of play. But in fact, this knight on d3 is very poorly placed, blocking in white's pieces, and this bishop is quite a monster. And black has very free development. You just have to look at white's pieces here. It takes some time to get them going. But it always surprises me that in this position, instead of knight f3, knight h3, played by Adolf Anderssen and later by Steinitz in his World Championship match against Chigorin. And Fischer, you'll find a game of Fischer's in his book, My 60 Memorable Games, where he played knight h3. Always surprises me that this move isn't more popular, actually. Although it looks very odd on h3. Well, this one looks odd out there as well, you know. Anyway, that's another matter. I digress. But instead of bishop e2, the main move, bishop d3, played by Stockfish, which also looks quite bizarre, blocking in this d pawn, but it's also a very old move and has recently come back into fashion, actually. So black plays knight d5, attacking the knight, and now after the knight goes back, develops, and this knight on in the middle, as we're going to see now, is used actively to grab that bishop. So this is very typical of AlphaZero. It absolutely loves the two bishops and also damages the structure. And this has been the starting point for quite a few games. Knight c3 is the most popular move here. There was a wonderful game played by Kasparov in a blitz match against Nigel Short, played in 2011. Where Kasparov won very, very nicely. But Stockfish grabbed that pawn on e5, which I've got to say is very brave. So, but white is now 2 pawns up, and some very serious players have taken this pawn as well. c5, logical move, preparing to bring the bishop to the diagonal. So opening up the diagonal, and of course the c-pawn controls that important d4 square, discouraging white from playing d4. Bishop b7. And now, well, David Howe, strong English Grandmaster, wants to drop the knight back here, which might be prudent actually, considering what happens in the game. But Stockfish played b3, preparing to bring out the bishop. So the question is, does black have enough compensation here for 2 pawns? 2 beautiful bishops, but let's see. Rook e8. And the knight heads back to c4. And this was taken. Now this is very interesting, because it feels like the most natural move here is to recapture this knight with the d-pawn. Like so. But now there is a very straightforward attack with queen h4, and there's a really nice variation here which foreshadows a variation we're going to see it a little bit later. Threatening mate. First of all, let's see what happens on h3. Well, then black has this wonderful move, bishop f3. That's the move that I was alluding to. If rook takes rook, we recapture, and queen takes, and there's a back rank checkmate. So we have to come here, back here, and if pawn takes, then queen takes, and well, it's going to be mate soon with either queen h2 or bishop h2. Let's go back here. So what about g3? Well, it looks terrible, doesn't it, to weaken this diagonal, and in fact there is an immediate and brutal reputation with this move. So if rook's pawn takes, then it's mate in the corner with the queen. So pawn takes here. But with these diagonals open, then white's king is not going to survive. So for example, if king f1, we come back, and bishop f3 is a winning move. And if rook e3, then black manages to take back all the material. Well, I say all the material, gets the knight back. And because this bishop is still there, you can see those light square weaknesses. This is absolutely horrible. Queen e4, just with the familiar battery on the long diagonal, and queen h1 is going to take lots of pawns with a continuing attack. Let's go back here. So that was, yes, I think I've dealt with those variations. So that's queen h4. So in this position, queen's pawn takes, actually loses. So first of all, Stockfish drags the queen away so it can't come to h4, and now recaptures. And again, you want to really recapture with the queen's pawn to straighten out the pawns. But there's a problem here, because mate threat, rook comes over, another mate threat, and well, this is just such a wonderful initiative for black. Well, it's pretty straightforward. The h-pawn's going to roll down the board. Those light square weaknesses are terrible. Fantastic compensation. So in this position, after the exchange of rooks, that's why Stockfish recaptured with the pawn, so that it has the option of blocking this diagonal with the knight, because the d-pawn is still there, so it supports the knight. So for example, if queen e5, the very natural move, threatening mate, defends the mate, and now knight e4. So you give back a pawn, but you block out this bishop. So that's the idea. Queen e6 played. Bishop b2. And now, you'd think that a move like rook e8 would give pretty decent compensation. I think it does. But AlphaZero's next move is very interesting. It plays rook b8. And this is a really sneaky move. And here is where the game goes wild, because Stockfish goes on an adventure with the knight, which looks, to my human eyes, so bizarre. The kind of thing that you'd never really consider here. If I were playing with white, would be terrified of this kingside attack, and I would keep that knight on c3 so that I could block out with knight d5 or knight e4 at some critical moment. Obviously, after rook b8, there are some threats to the bishop here. Yeah, even straight away, some kind of discovered attack. So rook b1 is a very natural move. But there are some really sneaky variations here. Let me just point one out. Queen g6. Now queen f1 is possible. But what about knight e4? Let's play like this. And this shows one of the ideas behind rook b8. So we'll take that off. So that beautiful bishop is gone. However, there is a problem with that rook on b1. It's now under fire from the rook and queen. So that bishop on b2 is pinned. And it's very hard for white to escape this. So queen b7 with the idea of bishop e5, just winning that bishop, and this is already very problematic for white. So that's the sneaky idea behind rook b8. It's funny, you wouldn't expect black to play like this when it feels like all the action should be on the king side, but it's a very clever move. So knight b5. So the knight goes on this adventure, which just looks bizarre. Queen g6, threatening a mate. So that's defended. And now the bishop is attacked, so bishop f4 all feels normal. And knight takes pawn a7. My goodness. I think what we're seeing here is the horizon effect. So Stockfish can calculate very, very deeply. However, not deep enough, because it's clear that after a few moves it has basically overlooked a very long and deep variation that means that black wins and makes this knight adventure look absolutely ridiculous. Nice move from AlphaZero now. h6. So in the middle of this slightly chaotic position, it takes a timeout to just give its king an escape square on h7. That's a very cool move. Bishop c3 from AlphaZero, and now queen h5. So mate threatened. h3. At the moment, it seems as though white is defending successfully. And now here is where AlphaZero played rook a8. And I'll come back to this position in a second, because there's something we need to clear up. But okay, rook a8 first. And here is where Stockfish meekly gave up the piece. So this is the game continuation. Allowed an exchange of queens. And rook takes knight, and this is a very simple ending to win, actually. So let's go back. So why not knight b5? Well, this is the finish that I mentioned in the book review, but I want to add a few more details. There's quite a lot to this position. So first of all, it would be really nice to swing this rook over. But after rook a6, in fact, queen d1 is an excellent defense, offering an exchange of queens. Remember, at the moment, white is 3 pawns up, so that would be a disincentive for black to go into an endgame. And if the queen tries to duck this exchange, then white keeps chasing. So rook a6 isn't possible at the moment, and that's why bishop f3 is the move. So once again, this move, we've already seen it in the game. So first things first, pawn takes bishop would allow rook a6. And the threat is to check here and then take here and game over. So white has to put the queen in the way. And you'd think here, well, you know, white has rook, knight and 3 pawns for the queen. Enough compensation? Well, I say compensation. I mean, black is basically just winning this position because there are so many targets for that queen. So white's king is weak. These pawns are weak. And actually, black is able to mop up very easily. Great thing about exchanging those bishops is that now the rook is vulnerable, and well, I could go further, but basically there are still too many weak points here for white to cover. This is winning for black. So let's go back. So this fantastic move, bishop f3, that's just been played. What about g3? The rook swings up. White desperately tries to defend. And now this wonderful move. And the rook comes over. And we're going to see this idea again. And if black tries to swing the bishop round, I'm afraid this doesn't work because the diagonal is blocked. And then there's no defense to, well, let's just show it. Here, check, and mate. Pretty fantastic stuff. So coming back here, and this is a variation I mentioned the other day, rook e1 is also insufficient after this. Same idea, but there is no defense. And, well, if white doesn't react here, so for example, let's just random move, play a4, then queen h4 followed by taking here is absolutely crunching. And if king h2, this, and once again this idea of rook g5 followed by queen takes and rook h5. No decent defense there. Okay, let's go back. So this is the position where bishop f3 was played, or could have been played. This is only a variation from the game. The question is, why couldn't this be played a move earlier? So let me go back to this position. So here is where AlphaZero played rook a8. And if knight b5, then bishop f3, as we've just seen, is a winning move. So the question is, why not bishop f3 straight away with exactly the same idea that if pawn takes, then rook b6 is a winning move, and otherwise black will just play rook b6 to g6. In fact, it doesn't work here. And here's why. Rook e1. And now knight c8. Incredibly, this knight, like the 7th Cavalry charging in at the end, actually stops black's attack. The rook can't come to g6 because of this fork, and after this the attack is just over. Black has nothing. So that was the point of rook a8, to force the knight back to b5, and then only then bishop f3. So then, well, queen d1 was played in the game. Let's just finish this off. I'll just show you how the game finished, but it was frankly not very interesting. Although white has 3 pawns, the 2 bishops are so powerful, and there are a lot of weak points here. Well, here Stockfish just gives up this pawn. This bishop can potentially come in to win this pawn here. There's also the idea of playing rook a3 and then bishop round. It's a horrible position. Black is going to win here. And of course, it's still possible to attack on the king side as well. Maybe an h pawn and g pawn advance. Ultimately, this is just a lost position for white. So Stockfish gave up this pawn, which is really hopeless, because there are simply no complications here. I know that I'm looking at this from a very human perspective, I must admit, but let me just show you. Basically, AlphaZero here just stays completely solid. So it's just making sure this pawn is protected. This one can't really advance because that's on prise. So AlphaZero is just keeping a steady ship here. Brings the king up, and the king came over. Hasn't even started pummeling away on the king side, which will give white something else to think about. Doesn't really do much. And in the end, well, Stockfish just kind of commits suicide here. But this bishop is about to occupy a beautiful square, and yes, I can see more advances taking place. d4 doesn't help the cause. We'll just go to the very end. And here is where the plug was pulled. Only 1 pawn for the piece, and very, very easy to win this position. So, I hope you enjoyed that. Some ways a very human attack from AlphaZero. I know these brilliances were, perhaps something very, very, very special, but the way it's built from the opening with the 2 bishops and just playing a very nice initiative, that I think was very human. I could see Kasparov or Shirov, playing that kind of game very, very easily. But there are a few star moves. I mean, obviously the idea with bishop f3, but I think this move was pretty incredible, actually. Sorry, coming back to this position after bishop b2. Rook b8. That is such a sneaky move, and I think that's somehow not very human. I think that's a very difficult move for a human to see somehow. Great stuff. If you want to see more AlphaZero games, then do check out the playlist. And if you want to see my book review of this book, Game Changer, then do check that out as well. You'll see the description down there. Available from newinchess.com. I highly recommend it.